Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you all to the panel 6 on China and Russia. I am Professor Yuanhua from Kookmin University in Seoul, and I'm going to be in the chair for this afternoon's panel. Today, we are privileged to have with us an interesting panel to discuss the relations between China and Russia. Over the last decade, China has become the world's second largest economy and increased its political stature in the international community. At the same time, Russia has also made significant progress in recovering its past political and economic influence. Moreover, both countries underwent leadership change in 2012, with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin chosen or elected as the new leader, respectively. This raises many important questions. How will Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin advance China and Russian relations? What will be the major points of mutual interest for the two countries economically and strategically? On what issues might they converge and diverge? How will China and Russia cooperate to reshape Northeast Asian regional architecture? All these important questions will be dealt with by each speaker in our panel. Let me introduce the speakers of our panel. We have 5 speakers, 3 from Russia and 2 from China. As we can see from their biography, all of them are distinguished scholars and specialists on the topic we are dealing with. The first speaker will be Dr. Andrei Kortunov. Dr. Kortunov is the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. He graduated from the Moscow State University of International Relations and holds a PhD in history from ISKRAN, the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute for the American and Canadian Studies. His research interests include international affairs, Russian foreign and domestic policy, and Russian-American relations. The next is Dr. Sergei Lukonin. Dr. Lukonin is the Director of Chinese Studies at IMEMR, the Institute of World Economy and International Relations. After having received a PhD in international economics from the Institute of Far Eastern Studies, he worked as a scientific fellow at the Center for Economic and Social Studies of China for many years. Now he holds an associate professorship at Plekhanov, Russian University of Economics. The next is Dr. Georgy Dollaraya. After having graduated from the Moscow University of International Relations in 1978, he began his career as a diplomat. He is the most experienced diplomat in Korean affairs, having served 2 positions in North Korea, then in South Korea as a deputy chief of the Russian embassy, and later as the senior Russian foreign ministry officer in charge of the Korean Peninsula. He now works for the Russian World Presidential Foundation in Moscow as department chief in charge of Asia and is the national coordinator and is concurrently the director of Korean research at the Institute of Economics of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Toloraya received a PhD in economics in 1984 and a full professor degree in Oriental Studies in 2002. The first Chinese speaker will be Professor Yang Xu from Lanzhou University. He is also the director of the Institute of Central Asian Studies. Professor Yang holds a master's degree from the Department of Geology and Geography of Yangzhou University. Previously, he was a lecturer at the same department and then was second secretary in the embassy of the Chinese embassy to the USSR from 1988 to 1991. Having returned to Yangzhou University, he served as the director of the Foreign Affairs Office and as vice president of the university. His research interests include Central Asian studies, anti-separatism, counterterrorism, and international relations theory. The last speaker will be Zhao Huirong. She holds a master's degree in political science from the China Foreign Affairs University and a PhD in political science from the Graduate School of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She is now an associate research fellow in the Institute of Russian, East European, and Central Asian Studies of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Her research interests include the politics and diplomacy of Central Asian and South Caucasian countries, as well as the Shanghai Cooperation organizations. Today, since we have 5 speakers, each speaker will be given 7 to 10 minutes to speak. Due to the time limit, I have to ask each of the speakers to confine his remarks to 10 minutes. At the end of the presentation, there will be about 20 minutes discussion time among the panelists. Then, at the end of the session, we will have an open discussion for about 15 minutes. I would like to call on Dr. Andrei Krutunov to present. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairperson. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm grateful for having an opportunity to be here and to participate in this very distinguished event. I'm really grateful to the Assam Institute. And let me say that since I'm the first to open the panel, I will try not to bore you with statistics on the trends in the Russian-Chinese trade or information on the signed agreements during the last visit of President Putin to Beijing. Instead, I would like to be a little bit provocative, if I might, and give you a normative picture, how the Russian-Chinese relations might evolve 10 years down the road, 20 years, maybe 30 years down the road. What kind of relations we would like to see between Moscow and Beijing? Do we have any models, any yardsticks to use in order to think about our preferred future? And let me tell you that if you look at the map, there are certain parallels between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. In Eurasia, you have China and Russia as 2 major powers, Russia being larger in terms of territory, but less populous. Russia has arguably more resources than China does. However, it doesn't have the capacity to manage this resource base. And in the Western Hemisphere, we have Canada and the United States, which are almost at the same level if you look at the balance of powers and the projections of the Canadian and American development. And if you look back into history, the American-Canadian relationship has never been a perfect relationship. In fact, the 2 nations even fought at least 2 wars. The history of the United States started with an attempt to conquer Canada, as we remember, and then in 1812, Canadians assisted British in conquering Washington, D.C. There was an arms race between Canada and the United States, and even now we see many problems, many disagreements between the 2 countries. For example, they take very different positions towards the Arctic region development. Even on security issues, there are disagreements between Americans and Canadians. However, nobody would deny that the relationship between Canada and the United States is progressing very well. And nobody would even consider a potential clash or confrontation, put aside the military conflict between Canada and the United States. So, for me, the question that we should probably address today is what is there in this relationship that has evolved in North America, which we do not have in Eurasia? What we can learn from the history of US-Canadian relationship and how we can apply it to the development of cooperation between Russia and China. And I would venture to say that there are three pillars which exist in relations between the United States and its northern neighbor, and these pillars so far do not exist in the relations between Russia and China, which makes this relationship very fragile, to say the least. And I'm sorry that I will sound probably a little bit trivial here, but I think it is important. If you take a long-term perspective, what has to be changed or what has to be created in the relations between Russia and China in order to bring more stability, more predictability to this very important relationship. So the first pillar, both the United States and Canada are liberal democracies. And as we know from the theory of international relations, liberal democracies usually do not fight each other. They might have very serious disagreements, they might quarrel quite a lot, they might go pretty naughty, but confrontation is not usually a term which we can use to describe the relationship between liberal democracies. So my first conclusion is that a lot in relations between Russia and China will depend on the ability or inability of the two countries to move ahead with a political democracy. We know that it's a bumpy road for both Russia and China. We know that both countries claim their own version of democracy, different from traditional liberal models. We know that both countries are accused of authoritarianism. However, I think that the future of the relationship will indeed develop on democratic institutions maturing in our two countries. This is important, especially if these two processes go hand in hand with each other. If there is a parallel process of democracy maturing in Russia and China. The second pillar, if you look at America and Canada, you can see that these countries are united by a myriad of various bonds. It's not just about trade. It's not just about investment. It's about culture. It's about humanitarian contacts. It's about social interaction. And if you look at the current state of relations between China and Russia, I think that to be fair, we have to recognize that the relationship is still rather superficial. Yes, indeed, China is the largest trading partner of the Russian Federation, but even if you look at the structure of this trade, the trade is limited primarily to large state companies. So we don't have this scale of social interaction that would add stability and predictability to the relationship. We don't have major constituencies of stakeholders that would be interested in maintaining and further developing this relationship. These constituencies are gradually emerging. This trade gradually goes beyond our traditional items of export and import, but this process is slow and precarious. So my take is that a lot will depend on our ability to expand communities of stakeholders on both sides. A lot will depend on bringing other actors to the table. This is not easy, but this is something that has to be done. Now, the third pillar, and I would say that it is an important pillar. Why Canada is not really concerned about the American domination? There are many reasons why Canadians are more or less benign towards Americans. But I think one reason is particularly important. If you look at the American-Canadian relations, they are a part of a larger, bigger multilateral system. Both the United States and Canada are members to the NATO alliance. Both belong to major Western Atlantic institutions where the United States and Canada have a say. Canada can afford to have very special relations with a number of European states. In certain ways, these relations are better than the relations that the United States has with the same states. Take, for example, the relations between Canada and France, a very interesting example of how a country like Canada might diversify its foreign policy portfolio. So I think it is important to make sure that this relationship between Russia and China is also an open system. That this relationship is balanced but by other bilateral and multilateral settings in the Asian Pacific. If it happens, countries like Russia, and I assume not just Russia, will feel less concerned about the overwhelming Chinese might. So it's trivial, but still, I would like to emphasize this point. A lot depends on our common ability or inability to achieve significant progress in building multilateral institutions in Northeast Asia. That would definitely serve the relationship between Russia and China. And finally, let me just end with that. If it doesn't happen, if we don't have these three pillars, so what's likely to happen in the relations between Russia and China? I don't think that it will be the end of the world. I don't think that a confrontation will start, but I think that if you take the worst case scenario, the relationship will remain rather superficial and will remain a hostage to personal relations and attitudes taken by the top political leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move to the next speaker. Dr. Konin.
Can I speak a little bit later because I have problem with my notebook? So
Oh,
can I change
yeah,
the places?
Yeah, okay.
It's okay. It's okay. It's all right.
Is it Korean technology?
No, Russian. Good afternoon, Dr. He. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. First of all, let me thank the Assam Institute for the opportunity to be here. And in my paper, I will attempt to answer the question included in the agenda of our section. And I try to be brief and will point only the main points. So, in my opinion, in contrast to relations with Washington, the relations between Moscow and Beijing are in no need of reset. In recent years, the tempo and depth of Russian-Chinese strategic partnership have seemed quite convincing. The main ways of Russian-Chinese relation development could be trade. As you know, both countries announced the plans to expand the volume of bilateral trade to 100 billion by 2015. Investment, by the end, for example, by the end of 2011, China's accumulated investment in Russia reached more than $27 billion, and Russia became China's 9th largest investment destination. In finance, local currency settlement between China and Russia has exceeded $2 billion since 2011, and Russia-Moscow interbank currency exchange, which started trade the yuan against the ruble in 2010, in the beginning of 2013 plans to expand the number of financial instruments nominated in yuan. Oil, gas, electricity supply, it is expected that China will import about 15 million metric tons of crude oil from Russia in this year, and China wants to expand the import to 30 million. In 2011, Russia supplied 1,200 million kilowatt hours of electricity, and in accordance with the agreement signed in 2010, the annual supply of coal should be at least 15 million tons. And China plans to expand the volume of coal to 20 million tons. Nuclear energy, Russia plans to build the second phase of Taiwan nuclear power plant and push forward cooperation in space nuclear power. Cooperation in the military and high-tech sectors, including aircraft manufacturing and the research and development of helicopters, aeronautics and astronautics. But there is a problem in these areas. For example, the bigger part of Russian export to China is the natural resources. The volume of Chinese investment in Russia, in Russian Far East, is relatively small. According to some reports, with a full provision of domestic consumption and export, many of our explored natural resources will come to an end to 2015. And there is a fear that Russia will not be able to provide the required volume of energy resources to China. Russian companies fear for the dependence on the Chinese market of hydrocarbons. Also, Russia and China still can't reach an agreement on price of crude oil and natural gas resources. In nuclear energy, China interested mainly in centrifuges and in technology of small reactors and fast neutron reactors. So if Russia will not transfer technology, the second phase of Tianwan nuclear power plant could be the last project of Atomstroy in China. And the same situation with military and technical cooperation. Russian companies afraid of losing the new technologies. And major points of mutual interest for the two countries economically and strategically might be. First of all, this is the modernization of Chinese economy. It is the possibility for Russian high-tech companies to enter the Chinese market. The development of the border territory, Russian Far East and northern provinces of China. Cooperation in the sphere of defense, security, counter-terrorism, especially after the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. And more active participation in global governance and first of all in the reform of international financial systems. On what issues might Russia and Chinese interests can diverge? China is becoming a strategic competitor of Russia in the traditional quarter of world leaders: USA, European Union, Japan and Russia. For Russia, a number of threats are acquiring increasingly clarity. Economically, as mainly an export of energy resources, it might find itself on the other side of barricades from the leading global importers of energy resources, including China politically. Politically, it might be farther removed from the West than China, pursuing, be it slowly. Because of democratic reforms in China, expansion of intra-party democracy, of the legal framework and rule of law, and so on. Under the condition of the global economic crisis, a clear trend was demonstrated for China to become Russia's competitor in the struggle for access to promising energy resources in the developing countries and to liquid assets in the developed economies. In the regional context, the competition with China is fiercest in Central Asia. In an effort to gain access to the energy resources of the region, Beijing makes most frequent use of Shanghai Cooperation Organization for soft political embracing of individual Central Asian countries. In the energy sector, China is counting on benefiting from the competition between Russia and Kazakhstan on the Central Asian oil market, and Russia and Turkmenistan on that for natural resources. Beijing makes use of conservative economic structure of the Central Asian countries for promoting its aid in, above all, the raw material sector for their economies. At the bilateral level of relations with Russia, Beijing is becoming increasingly harsh and aggressive in protecting its interest in the Russian direction, the interest of the citizens and companies working on the Russian market. The second question is, how will China and Russia cooperate to reshape North Asian regional architecture? It's my opinion it's not quite correct to talk only about bilateral cooperation within Northeast Asia between Russia and China. The real powers in Northeast Asia are China, Japan and South Korea. Of course, Russia wants to participate in this process, but our economy is too small to compete with China, Japan, and South Korea.
Excuse me?
Mm-hmm.
Your time
Okay,
is
and
also.
finally, I would like to point out that. Just wait a little bit. So the main problem for Russia that our country begin to compete with China, and it's real danger for us. And I think that the main idea for Russia is to participate in any cooperation with China. So that's all.
Thank you. Yeah. Let's now move on to the next speaker, Dr. Dololaya.
Thank you, Mrs. Chairperson. Well, I'm really pleased that Asan Institute has emerged as a hub for real in-depth studies, international studies, including the such well aspect which hasn't been researched before in Korea. That's the China-Russia relations. So, not being a China specialist, I still want to share some of the ideas with you to start maybe some kind of discussions. I would point out four or maybe 4.5 aspects of Russia-Chinese relations and reasons for Russia-Chinese relations being, as both country leaders say, the best ever for the whole history of relations between China and Russia, which is probably true. Why is it so? As I've said, I see four points: historical, geopolitical, economic, and regional. Let's start from history. Historically, after the breakup of Soviet Union, Russia really wanted to be a part of the Western world, to be integrated into Europe. But we soon found out that we are too big to be a part of Europe, and we could not be an ally of the United States, being submissive to the United States. Moreover, Russian both population elite more and more felt a sort of hostility of the West, and sometimes wasn't quite sure of the Western intentions. I'm not ready to say that this pushed us into Chinese embrace, but anyway, we couldn't ignore China, the great giant emerging at our own doorstep. And this emergence coincided with the decline of Soviet Union and Russia over the last 30 years. In a way, China, the modern China, I cannot say that's a Soviet creation, but anyway, the model of the Chinese development was initially imposed on China by Soviet Union, and Chinese communists used to look at Soviet communists as their, well, elder brother. And there are stories that even Mao Zedong once suggested to Stalin China to become a republic in the Soviet Union, obviously aiming at being the heir to Stalin, and thus becoming the head of the greatest empire in the history of humankind. Of course, this time is long gone, but at least unlike with Europeans, to which Russians sometimes feel inferior, although we do not usually pronounce that, but Europe for us is something of an ideal, something we should reach out for. While China for us, we don't feel superior to China, but, because it's different civilization. But we do feel that Chinese do respect Russian opinion, and we can understand each other, being simply too different psychologically and mentally to become real enemies, although such a period did exist in our history. There's a paradox for Russian elite. That although a Russian elite would like to lead an American way of life, a Western way of life, it will understand that to do so, it must be close to China in order to be able to have a strong position in the world affairs. So there's a sort of ambivalence in Russian elite we should take into account. Second, well, modern world is more and more becoming polycentric. I don't like the word multipolar. I would rather prefer the word polycentric, but whatever you call it, that global governance or global regulations, as they call it now, is more based on not only on certain poles, but on the networks and groupings. And as such, China for Russia is becoming the obvious anchor, the obvious instrument to preserve its positions and increase them in the future. Russia is not strong enough to be a dominant power in the world these days. And we should become a sort of a member of some grouping or some association which could become the pole or the power center of the global politics. One of the first experience both for Russia and China was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It wouldn't probably evolve as a East Flank NATO, Eastern NATO or something like that. It has more of a limited purposes. But anyway, this paved the way for strategic thinkers in both countries to engage in some new projects. And I would like to draw attention to BRICS project, which is no longer just an acronym for the swiftly developing economies, which it is no longer is, but a name of a new global actor, which is pulling closer and closer together, both in G20 and in International Monetary Fund, and soon in international affairs, to become a real new force in the alliance of reformers or global regulations. And actually the BRICS phenomenon grew out of Russian-Chinese axis, and it largely due to Russian intellectual and diplomatic efforts that this undertaken, although not all believe in its future, is gaining force. And thus we have an advantage of diplomatic edge, because traditionally Russian diplomacy is much stronger than the internal politics and somehow compensates for the for Russian failures and Russian weakness in internal politics. So I would like to draw your attention to the fact, little noticeable fact, that Russian-Chinese cooperation in BRICS and the BRICS forming as itself might become a major factor for the future global governance, well, at least in this century. Of course, there are lots of fears, geopolitical fears in Russia about China, and the previous speakers have mentioned some aspects of this. There are fears that military cooperation with China would eventually lead to the extent of militarization of China, which would enable it either to attack Russia or to dominate it. There are fears that the influx of Chinese into Russian Far East would eventually lead to the colonization of Far East by China, which is somehow happening economically. There are fears that a new Chinese expansionism would demand from Russia either to support it or to be subordinate to this new world order, Chinese style, which is China is feared to try to introduce. I think these fears are a bit exaggerated, and I'll tell you why. First, economically. Well, economically, we can hear a lot of mantras that Russian Far East is subordinate to China, that Russia is playing a sort of how do you call it, a raw material appendix role to China. But I would say, well, most of the world, other world countries do. Well, take Australia. It's exporting raw materials to China and importing the ready-made goods, the consumer commodities. And almost many of the countries do the same. So in Russia and China, we have a sort of safe complementarity in our economic relations. And this is this is something, well, I think Ricardo 200 years ago mentioned as the comparative costs of production, which makes it inevitable for the countries to produce and export what is abundant of and which it's competitive in. So I don't see Russian cars being popular in Chinese market any longer. No Russian electronics, no Russian consumer goods, no Russian clothing. Maybe in the future we should pay more attention to technologies, to technological advance and joint technological research. But that doesn't mean that this sort of division of labor we have now with China is dangerous for Russia. It can hurt national pride of Russia, but anyway, this is the fact of life we have to deal with. Canada and U.S. was mentioned here by Dr. Kortanov, and well, also I would say, for example, Mexico and the United States. Mexican economy is very much tied to the United States, but that doesn't necessarily mean that because of it, Mexico is becoming less developed. It's not because of it. It's just the historical factors that is bringing such a situation. Okay, I'll skip the figures. I'll skip the data because of lack of time. I would move to the regional aspects of Russia-Chinese cooperation. Russian Far East is the backyard so far, have been so far for Moscow politicians. The situation is changing over the last several years. We are paying more attention to our eastern frontier, and Russia is moving to the east. And Russia is being called a Euro-Pacific power, which have also equal interest in Europe and the Pacific. And it is, like the United States, a resident Pacific power. And our ascension to the East Asian Summit mechanism is also a very important step in this direction. But anyway, having said that, I would like to say that this is not enough. And Russia, fortunately not, but it does recognize Chinese supremacy in Asian affairs. And well, some may not agree to this, but in many aspects we just support Chinese policies vis-à-vis Asia, delegating our authorities to Beijing, be it in the United Nations Security Council or in other international fora. Although this has been in an easy support lately because of growing Chinese expansionism. In case with Vietnam, for example, we are really at a loss because both countries are our strategic partners, and Russian companies do have some interest in the disputed area of the sea and islands of Vietnamese coast. So this is one of the examples of the problems we may encounter. At the same time, I think it would be most interesting for this auditorium, for the people who are here in this room, in this city of Seoul. What about Russia-Chinese cooperation on Korean affairs? I would like to say that Russia and China share the general principle, the bottom line of stability first in Korea, stability in Korean Peninsula, no unforeseen incidents, no catastrophic developments in Korea, and thus our political line is very much similar. At the same time, I should say that that Russia do recognize the limits of its influence in Korean affairs and have to follow Chinese lead in many cases. Although there are some nuances. You will soon see it through discussions in the United Nations Security Council on the today's rocket launch or satellite launch of North Korea, because China would eventually be much more lenient, probably to this development than Russia can afford to be. Although, of course, deep in our heart, we do not want new sanctions, new isolation of Korea. But at the same time, we really cannot afford to close our eyes at this violation of international law and the resolutions and the decisions of the United Nations,
May I interrupt you?
Okay. One last point is that Russia and China do have some contradictions in Korean Peninsula, including, for example, trilateral projects, because I understand that China wouldn't be too happy to see the Russian pipeline and a railroad because of its business interests. Thank you.
Now let's move to the Chinese speaker. Yeah. Professor Yang Ju, would you start?
The China-Russia relation is most important for China, also with Russia. And there is a lot of different view, different opinion. I view the China-Russia mutual trust from the perspective of the cultural communication. All people know this long history of China-Russia relationship. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, from last century, from 1950s to the early 1960s, two countries had enjoyed a short-term alliance and a close friendship. However, contradictions and conflicts were much more. There had even occurred military confrontation in borders. Since Russian federal independence in 1992, China-Russia relations has become into a new era of equal, pragmatic, and cooperating. Cooperation in political, economic, and cultural fields has all been developing. Now, China calls the contemporary China-Russia relationship the best in history. Last week, our Premier Wen Jiabao once again said like this, the best in history. I agree. However, frankly speaking, there still exist quite some problems and obstacles, among which lack of the mutual trust is the most important one. Nowadays, the China-Russia mutual trust only exists between, I think, the top leaders, but far from the representing among the public. I'd like to share some personal opinions about this problem from viewpoint of culture. I think culture is the most useful tool for two countries' people to know each other and the most favorable channel for communication. In the 1950s, China and the Soviet Union were in the best age of friendship, while the cultural communication had also come to a peak. And it is during this period, people of the Soviet Union and this country had been truly understood by people of China. Russian Soviet Union literature, movies, dramas, and paintings, I can say, rushed into China and were widely admired, especially by young intellectuals. Thanks to these understandings, even after the breakup of two governments' relationship, Chinese people had never shown any hatred towards the people of Soviet Union. I think communication is very important in culture. In China, if you ask someone who is Tolstoy, Lermontov, Pavel Kachagin, or Matrosov, maybe the answer would not be very accurate, but they will say the Soviet Union people are good people. This is what cultural communication would bring to us. Since the independence of Russia Federal, cultural communication between two countries has had an obvious developing with support from both governments. However, in my point of view, current communication still hasn't reached the level of 1950s yet. I think this is because of the following reasons. First, neither China nor Russia has outstanding cultural products which could be accepted by each other. It's very interesting. Products is translated to Russia is the продукты, means food, правильно, да? So it's not enough food for people. Second, both China and Russia are still re-identifying and reshaping themselves in the cultural level. In other words, they are both in a period of cultural confusion. Not confused. Third, in the era of globalization, neither China nor Russia has learned how to create a new culture under an environment of market economy. Fourth, Western cultural products have occupied a large share of cultural markets, both in China and Russia. It is several years ago, I was translating Russia in Search of Yourself. This is a book, maybe you know, the Russian publication is translated in Russia is Россия в поисках себя. This idea has come to my mind, and I think this reason could also help to answer a question Chinese often raise to their Russian friends. Why is there no Tolstoy in Russia anymore? Actually, Russians could also ask Chinese why China doesn't have Lu Xun anymore. Frankly speaking, the current China-Russia cultural communication is not satisfying. It always emphasizes the skill rather than contents. Takes education communication as an example. According to the data from Chinese Ministry of Education, there are about 9,000 Russian students in China and 20,000 Chinese students in Russia. This skill is not small, but I think among them, the number of outstanding one is quite embarrassing. To change this situation, endeavors from both countries are needed. Besides of this, Russian cultural products in China are very rare. No matter the movies, TV shows, or literature, it is very hard to find a Russian one, now in China. Recently, I did a survey in my city, in Lanzhou, in the bookstores, and it turned out I could not find even a single book written by a post-independent Russian writer. I guess it would also be very hard to find modern Chinese literature in Russian bookstores. There are a lot more such examples, and I don't have to list them all. What I want to emphasize here is, it is difficult to build a lasting mutual trust between two countries without a full mutual understanding at the public level. The biggest obstacle of promoting the strategic partnership between China and Russia would be the lack of mutual trust. Endeavors from all aspects are needed to change this situation. And with those thoughts, improving the cultural communication could be the most effective way. Thank you.
Now move to the last speaker.
The organizer of the forum asked me to talk about relationship between China and Central Asia. Everybody knows Central Asian countries, either China's neighbor countries, are very close to China in geography. These countries take the important part of China's good neighborly diplomacy in China's diplomatic strategy. Therefore, in Central Asia, China pursues the foreign policy of being a good neighbor and a partner and building amicable, tranquil, and prosperous neighborhood. The relation between China and the Central Asian countries have experienced the three stages. The first stage from 1992 to 1995 is a stage of mutual knowledge and understanding. The second stage from 1996 to 2000 is a development stage. There is a breakthrough in cooperation between China and the Central Asian countries. China and the Central Asian countries resolve the boundary problems. Oil-gas cooperation between China and Kazakhstan make substantial progress. Both sides have had more consensus and take more practical measures in deepening political mutual trust and promotion economic and human cooperation, as well as cooperation against terrorism. The bilateral ties rose from a friendly relationship to partnership. The third stage, since 2001 up to now, is the stage of rapid increases in bilateral relations. In 2001, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was established. In 2007, China and the Central Asian countries signed a long-term good neighborly and friendly cooperation treaty. In 2009, gas began to flow through China's Central Asian gas pipeline. The economic and trade relations between China and the Central Asian countries have rapid development. In 1992, the trade amount between China and the 5 Central Asian countries was only $460 million. But in 2011, the figure is already $36.45 billion. Why relations between China and the Central Asian countries can be so smooth and a continuous improvement? We can see the trend. The relationship between China and the Central Asian countries, like this one. It's very good. I think there are at least 5 major regions. The first is China and the Central Asian countries have a lot of same diplomatic ideas. Both sides pay attention to the development of good neighborly and friendly relations. The second is both sides share a lot of common interests in the development cooperation. Both China and the Central Asian countries have faced the domestic tasks, maintain political stability, promote economic development, and improving the people's livelihood. the two sides can achieve mutual benefit and win-win results if they can make cooperation in economy and regional security. The third is the two sides are able to handle differences and understand each other as much as possible and try to resolve the problems flexible. For example, when they're handling boundary problem, processing differences in economic cooperation and security issues, both sides usually try to stand in others' shoes, keep the good neighborly and friendly relationship in mind, try to come to understanding, find a solution to the problem. The fourth is both sides attach importance to strengthening political mutual trust to keep the communication mutual visit frequently. The last is both sides take advantage of SAO platform and strengthen multilateral cooperation. Therefore, the pursuit of peace, development, and cooperation has been fully reflected in the relationship between China and the Central Asian countries. The relationship between China and the Central Asian countries can be seen as the model of friendly cooperation relationship between the countries with different social systems and national power. Thank you.
Thank you all for your excellent presentations. We now have 15 minutes. So first of all, we'll have a discussion among the panelists. If you have any questions or comments on each other, please. Yeah.
I would like to really thank Mr. Dr. Yang for putting this issue of intercultural cooperation between China and Russia. I happen to work for the Ruski Mir, Russian World Presidential Foundation, which is a sort of soft power organization for promoting Russian culture and language abroad. And China is the most lucrative market, actually, for us, would I say. We have already opened 7 Russian centers in different parts of China, and we have given grant support to several projects in China. Well, China is opening Confucius centers in Russia, and it's only the lack of funds, not the lack of interest, which hinders this progress of soft power exchange and soft power cooperation. So I think that we both understand the problem. We both see the difficulties, and we are not abstaining from doing anything. We're trying to do something to overcome these barriers.
So there was a comment, not
Yeah.
a question. Okay. Yeah. Any other question?
I have a comment, but I will probably refrain. Maybe we should first ask the audience to submit questions, if any, because I don't want to eat the time. Yeah.
Okay. Then let's open the floor for any questions and comments. Yeah. Please identify yourself before asking.
This is Günal Özkan from International Strategic Research Organization, Ankara.
Okay.
I would like to ask a question, Mr. Kortuno, and our last speaker as well. My question is that you elaborated the Chinese-Russian relations, not what they are not in terms of China, U.S.-Canada relations. We defined that. That is a bit big optimistic way of looking to in terms of comparing the relationship, it seems to be perfect for the China, U.S.-Canada relations. My question is that what role the demand of both sides for perhaps over a decade, maybe longer, to demand a multipolar world, China and Russia, in the development of the relationship? You described the relationship more personal. Yes, it is true. There are economic base and many other bases, but what role do you think that that urge is playing? Because one side is claiming to be one of the greatest power in the world, China, and the other was one of the greatest power, but trying to reclaim it, coming back. It's in that urge. What role that is going to play? If that is a real point, it seems that we shouldn't worry about it for at least for a foreseeable future in any break in Chinese-Russian relations. Will you comment on that? And then my second question to the last speaker is that how likely is to keep that China-Russian relations in Central Asia by having common organization and keeping contact while they have such a demand on economics and energy in the same area, while they need that economic development and advancement. How likely is it? Is that going to be cause a sort of clash of interest and risk? Is that carrying that such a risk between these two big powers? Thank you very much.
Okay, I will collect a few more questions and then we will reply. So is there any other questions? Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Laura Solomon from the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. I appreciated all of the presentations today. My question pertains also to Professor Kortunov's observations about these three pillars. In particular, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this issue of, first of all, do all three pillars have to be fulfilled, in other words? And then secondly, are there any pillars that are more important among those three? I ask this because it seems like SCO, BRICS, UNSC, the coordination between China and Russia is already existent, or do you see that as a point of maybe friction between the two, competition? And also, just as was just mentioned in terms of exchange, you do have the Confucius Institute, you do have Russian centers. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that. Thank you.
Any other questions? Then you can ask your question first and then...
let me just make then a comment, kind of responding to the two questions that were raised here. First of all, on incentives, on the driving forces. Why? I think that if you take, this global look at the contemporary world, it is fair to say that what we see right now is an evident deficit of governance. All the institutions, like the United Nations, cannot cope with many crises. New institutions are too fragile. Old leaders, like the United States, turn out not to be efficient in certain situations like Iraq or Afghanistan. NATO experiences major problems in just keeping the budgets high enough. So if we see this very clear lack of governance, what countries like China and Russia can do? Essentially, in my view, there are only two ways to act given the current situation. The first way would be to take an opportunistic approach. Suppose, Russia and China have a kind of anti-Western position on Syria. We just veto your proposals, and that's it. We come with some ideas, but they do not constitute an alternative vision. They are not a major contribution to the global or to the regional governments. So, in a way, Russia and China are free riders, each country in its own way. The other approach would be to take the task of global governance seriously. And that means that both countries have to sacrifice some of their short-term interests in order to make the whole system more stable. It means that we can no longer rely on the United States. We cannot bandwagon or we cannot oppose the leader. And I think this is the incentive, because in order to prosper, in order to develop, both Russia and China need a special external environment. And it seems that without their engagement, it would be more and more difficult to rely on such an environment. We cannot rely on Americans to take care of international terrorism or Afghanistan. We cannot rely on the West to handle Pakistan issue. So for me, the question is whether leaderships in both countries mature to the extent that they will realize the strategic importance of a new approach to global governance. And this is something that they keep them together. I think that we see some of that in these new structures like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but still it is a very early stage. And I don't want to be too critical, but I think on many issues, both Russia and China take rather opportunistic approaches, which has to be changed in future. Now, on the second question, if I might, I would say that all three pillars are important, but in terms of what should be done or what can be done first, and what can be done faster, low-hanging fruit, so to say, I would place these pillars in the reverse order. I would say it is easier to create some multilateral structures in Northeast Asia than to bring another dimension to the relationship, because this another dimension requires many more people, and we heard that the cultural dimension is still underdeveloped, and it is easier to bring this cultural dimension than to move to mature democracies, because it will require very fundamental change. And I agree that this is a very optimistic view. I said that it is a normative position. This is something that I would like to see happen in our relationship. My take is that even if we are successful in the third dimension, multilateralism, that would be already a major accomplishment, especially at the level of the political establishments in Russia, for sure. If we move to the second, it would engage new stakeholders, new constituencies. And if we move to the first pillar, if countries become really, mature democracies, then of course their position vis-à-vis other players will also change quite significantly.
Okay. I think another question went to Dr. Heeok.
I can answer your question about the relationship between China and Russia in Central Asia. It's a very hard question. Many colleagues ask me about the competition in energy in Central Asia between China and Russia. I think some people overstate this situation. Firstly, I want to say Central Asian countries are independent countries. They and great powers are equal in this world, and they have right to choose partners, including Russia, China, and the United States. They want get more benefits and profit through cooperation with different partners. For China recognize and respect the close connection between Russia and Central Asian countries, including in the energy. And we pay attention the good relationship between China and the Central Asian countries, as well as between China and Russia. We are strategic partnership, And yes, in the energy, it's in the market. Chinese enterprise maybe have the competition with the enterprises from other countries, including Russia. But I think our enterprises and government will flexible. They handle the differences in this way. And they want cooperation with Russia, with other countries in this area. Through cooperation, we want to get our goal. Is my answer. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have about 5 more minutes. So is there any question? Yep. First and yeah.
I'm Alexander Buch from Victoria University, Wellington. I have 2 questions, one to Dr. Kortunov and one to Dr. Toleraya. I'd like to push a bit further, and I think this was something that our Turkish colleague wanted to ask in a way as well. But basically, using your Canada-US analogy, who do you see as Canada in the China-Russia relations? And I think you understand what I'm trying to say.
Look at the map.
So basically the question is, to paraphrase it, I mean, is there, and this is actually something that Dr. Toleraya was saying, but I'm not sure if it is shared, this idea of Russia not as a superpower, but actually as a middle power in the West. Is this idea shared by the ruling elites? And I think this is something indispensable for further developing smooth relations between Russia and China, and Russia and obviously other powers as well. So this is my first question. And to Dr. Toleraya, I was wondering, what is the difference between Ruski Mir and Россотрудничество? And who is in charge of establishing Russia centers? And is it really a problem of budget? Or maybe there are other problems there that make them really, and unfortunately, not very visible in the areas where they function. Thank you very much.
Can I continue?
Yeah.
Mirza Hidakian from Uzbekistan. Let me ask our nice Chinese colleague. I have 2 brief questions. The first one is, which one we was asked yesterday, what's problem relation between China and Central Asia from the Chinese perspective? And second question is, what probably will be Chinese policy toward the Afghanistan coming few years when situation is a little bit changing? It will be strong bilateral approach, or it will be a little bit multilateral approach? Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to raise a question?
No, let me then, drop
Yeah,
it,
okay.
since...
Yeah. If there isn't any more questions, I will ask Dr. Kortunov and Toleraya to comment on the question.
Well, let me first say that, history teaches us that it's hard to cure post-imperial traumas of nations. And if you go to the United Kingdom, for example, or to France, you will find, these phantom pains of the empires that these countries lost about half century ago. It is still there. So I don't think that with Russia it will be any easier. However, I think a lot depends on whether Russia finds a role for itself to play in the international relations. And the good news is, of course, that the criteria of greatness are changing. And, a century ago, there were a clear set of definitions of superpower. Today, it is not that evident. So my answer would be trivial, that I count on the new generation of Russians who are better educated, who travel to other countries, who are more self-centered, who belong to this new world, to this cosmopolitan community. Again, I don't think that nationalism is always bad, but I think that it has to be moderated, and it can be moderated. So definitely in this equation, Russia stands for Canada, while China stands for the United States. But let me tell you that on many issues, Americans envy Canadians. Canadians arguably have a better medical system, for example, or in hockey, I think that Canada might be superior to the United States. So, it really depends on what dimension you take into account. And I hope that in future, this whole notion of superpower will be replaced by something very different. That's my optimistic vision of the future.
Dr. Tulare?
Well, first I would add to Dr. Kotnov that I think that the age of superpowers is gone. Superpower was the term invented to describe the competition strategic rivalry between USSR and USA. There are no more superpowers left. They're great powers. Some stronger, some weaker, some rising, some declining, but we have a multi-polycentric world where these powers do compete and do cooperate, and Russia shouldn't necessarily feel inferior, that it's weaker than economically than China. It is not progressing as fast as it is. We've got enough resources and enough to be proud on our own. And as to the Ruski Mir Foundation, let me answer this in private because it's a little bit long answer. But we are trying to promote Russian culture and Russian soft power all around the world, not successfully everywhere, of course.
Yeah. I think.
Okay. The first question, I think, we have to do many things to improve the relationship between China and Central Asian countries. Although I already said our relationship is very good, the trend is good. I think the main problem is the mutual trust. Just now, our colleagues talk about the mutual trust between China and Russia. I think between China and the Central Asian countries too, we need to know each other. Now, although we have some candles to know each other, but I don't think we know each other very well. So I think the next step is we need to do more in the culture exchange. The second question about the policy of China to Uzbekistan, Afghanistan. I think that maybe Professor have the more answer because he is in China. He is a very important, very famous expert in the anti-terrorism.
I think the time is over.
Okay. Yeah, actually, our time is almost up. So I'd like to close the panel. I'd like to thank all the panelists and the audience for taking part in the lively and interesting discussion. Thank you.